Today is a historic day for our country. After over 50 years of conflict, death, and pain, we have brought to an end the armed conflict with the FARC.
It began as a peasant revolt over economic issues and became the longest-running conflict in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Colombian Civil War may, at long last, be coming to an end. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was 1964 when the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC, first took up arms against the Colombian government. Over the next half-century, more than 220,000 people were killed and 5 million displaced. 50,000 more simply disappeared. For a time, the country was known as the kidnapped capital, thanks in large part to FARC's abductions to help finance its forces. But all that may have come to an end last month when Colombia's president, Juan Manuel Santos, and FARC leader Rodrigo Londono signed a ceasefire agreement. Later, we'll talk with a leading Colombian politician, but we begin in Bogotá with CCTV's Toby Muse. And Toby, that ceasefire was negotiated between the Colombian government and FARC leaders over the past 3 years in Cuba. What can you tell us about that agreement?
Well, the ceasefire is certainly seen here in Colombia as a milestone within that agreement. The process, Colombians began feeling quite skeptical about this peace process. Remember, there had been various attempts to negotiate with the FARC since its founding in the 1960s, but no ceasefire, no agreement has ever got as far as a ceasefire. And I think the feeling within Colombia now is this peace process is irreversible. Of course, the ceasefire is part of a larger agreement. That agreement includes demining. Colombia has one of the highest numbers of landmines in the world. There's also a commitment by the government to invest in the countryside. So, as the FARC say, the countryside isn't as abandoned as it was historically. There's also an agreement to eradicate coca, the raw material used to make cocaine. Now the speculation is, when will this deal be signed? We think it might be signed on July 20th, which would be apt because that's Colombia's Independence Day. And there's a symbolism there that I think the Colombian government and the FARC like. It's the birth of a new Colombia, a Colombia in peace.
And Toby, what needs to happen next to finally bring peace to Colombia?
Well, once the deal between the two, then the FARC guerrillas will congregate in around 24 safe zones dotted around the country. Once the FARC guerrillas are there, then will begin what is possibly the most important part of this peace process, the disarmament. There's a very clear timetable of 180 days. The FARC has to demobilize and disarm all of its troops. At that point, the government will then put the vote to the Colombian people, will give the Colombian people the chance to vote on the peace accord. They'll take it to a plebiscite. Latest polls show that most Colombians are in favor of this peace deal. But there's an irony of this I would point out. As President Juan Manuel Santos receives praise from across the world for his handling of this peace deal, at home he's actually very, very unpopular. One poll in May gave him just a rating of 20%. So it's going to be interesting to see how the president's popularity will figure in the campaign for the peace process.
Thanks, Toby. That's CCTV's Toby Muse reporting from Bogotá. Joining us here in Washington is Professor Eric Langer. He focuses on Latin America at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Also with us is Juan Carlos Hidalgo. He's a Latin America policy analyst at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. And joining us from Medellin via Skype is Paloma Valencia. She's a Colombian senator with the Democratic Center Party. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Senator, let me start with you. There have been many attempts at peace in Colombia. Up to now, all have failed. Do you believe that this ceasefire deal and possible peace agreement will hold this time?
I don't think so. I think that you shouldn't treat in equal terms peace with an agreement with one of the terror organizations that have action over the Colombian territory. In 1991, actually, we had a new constitution, and they promised us peace in that precise word, saying that the negotiation with other guerrillas will end all the killings in Colombia. And actually what happens after the new constitution, it was the 90s, it was a horrible hell for Colombians. Everybody was kidnapped, everybody was killed. Because what happens in Colombia is that we have illegal drug trafficking and illegal mining that gives a lot of money to any criminal organization, and what we're doing is that trying to negotiate with one, and they're reborning with a new name with the same money and the same capacity of killing Colombians.
What do you make of that, Eric? The senator doesn't seem very optimistic there that this is a deal that'll hold, saying that there are some parties, I presume she's referring to the ELN, which is another guerrilla group, which is not party to this agreement, that's not signed on.
Well, I think the real problem is what's going to happen after the peace process finishes. And I think the senator has a point, namely that the real difficulty isn't going to be signing a peace process or the peace accords, which I think is basically in the bag at this point, but rather what's going to happen afterwards and whether the state can actually expand its power, its influence, have, in Weberian terms, a monopoly of over the violence in the rest of the country. And I think that's really the biggest challenge for the Colombian government, because that's when the hard work really starts. We have other places where you've had a peace process which has been successful, but which still maintains lots of violence and problems. El Salvador, Guatemala, where you have really high rates of homicide and crime. And the question is, how do you get people who have been fighting all their lives and basically learned how to kill people, do something else afterwards? And that takes a lot of resources, and it also means that the state really has to be able to, if you will, embrace them and bring them into the system, which is what the peace accords are supposed to do, but you need enough resources for that. And the question is if there are enough resources for that. So in fact, that is a problem. But on the other hand, the peace process, I think, is a really good first step, but it's really on the first step in a much longer process.
Juan Carlos, that does raise the question of, as Eric points out, how do you get people who've been engaged in a war for most of their lives do something else? The reason for this war initially was because of economic inequality, land reform. Have those issues been addressed?
Well, part of the agreement has to deal with that, land redistribution, trying to give opportunities to people, to these soldiers that have been engaging in a war for over 40 years. But right now, Colombia is a thriving economy. It has a decent growth rate, 4%. It has enormous disparities, for sure, and those need to be addressed through education, through bringing the state, as Professor Langer says, to those regions where the state has been absent all these years. My concern is, picking what the senator said, is that as long as drug trafficking remains illegal, namely coca cultivation and cocaine production, there's going to be a very profitable industry there, going to remain in hands of criminals. So far, yes, the FARC began as a peasant movement, but it morphed into a terrorist, criminal, drug trafficking organization, and is being in charge of Colombia's cocaine production for many years. And the estimates vary how much money they make yearly on cocaine production. Some people say $500 million a year. Some put the figure at 1.5 billion.
Are you saying that a criminal element in Colombia can then undermine this entire peace agreement?
I can say that they can morph again. I mean, the FARC as an entity can cease to exist, but that doesn't mean that the people behind this business are going to just go away. They're probably going to keep some arms, and they're going to rearm again, and they're going to keep threatening the peace of the Colombian people.
So, Senator, what are the obligations that this ceasefire agreement and possible peace deal place on the two sides right now?
Well, I don't like this peace agreement at all. First of all, because it didn't give jail to criminals that committed crimes against humanity, and that is a very bad example for Colombia. If you want to build a peace, you will really need to be focusing on giving the good example to the society. In this ceasefire that they agree, it has very complicated issues. First of all, the government has made an alliance with a terror organization as FARC to combat against all other terror organizations in the territory. I think that it's very dangerous because you're losing as a state your legitimacy to have the monopoly of the gangs, the monopoly of the violence, as someone mentioned earlier. So this agreement remembers a very sad part of Colombian history in which one government make a deal with some other drug dealers, cartels to kill Pablo Escobar. And it was a very horrible thing to say, but it did happen. So I'm really worried that that's the way this agreement is going, because what you should do to give peace to Colombia is to build strong institutions, just institutions, to have a very strong presence all over the territory. But it seems that we're weakening the law, we're weakening the institutions, and we're hurting the legitimacy of the state. So I think it's a very dangerous agreement for the Colombian people.
Right. Eric, the Senator has some valid points there, but the question is, what's the alternative?
Well, I think that's the issue. The party that the senator represents is, if you will, says everything has to be pure and has to be good, and the state really has to be as strong as possible, and there has to be essentially, if not a military victory, something close to that. And I can understand that. The problem is that politics is sausage making. It's ugly. And to a certain extent, I think it's really difficult to see how the Colombian state could ever get to that point without making some kind of deals. And obviously politics is presumably the art of the possible, and I think this is what's possible right now. That doesn't mean that the government shouldn't, and security forces shouldn't continue pressuring first of all the ELN, but also the former members of the FARC once that happens, and continue to expand the state presence. But I think what's really important here is to make sure that the state continues to fortify. And I think when you do that, then there's a chance for this in the next 10 years to basically a peace truly take hold. And that's why, in that sense, I'm in agreement with the senator that this is not an easy process. It's not going to be pretty. There are going to be lots of people who are not going to be on it. They're going to keep their arms. They're going to become criminal gangs, et cetera, et cetera. But as you say, what's the alternative? And for me, this is actually a really good first step. The hard part, like I say, isn't right now. It's what comes afterwards.
It is a first step. And, you know, Juan Carlos, the leader of FARC, Rodrigo Londono, he put it this way. He said, look, this is not a surrender by FARC, but there is a recognition that on both sides, that neither side was able to win militarily.
That's a key point. And let's remember where this peace process began. It began with the FARC being extremely weakened after over a decade of being pounded by the military. Let's go back to the beginning of the century. The beginning of the century, Colombia was about to be taken over by the FARC. Right. Literally, the FARC surrounded the biggest cities, Medellin, Cali, Bogota. And the discussion here in Washington was at what point the FARC were going to run into Bogota and take over the government. Probably that's an exaggeration, but that's how many Colombians actually felt back then. It was because of the security policies of President Álvaro Uribe that we saw the FARC taking major hits in the amount of territory they control, and seeing some of their leaders being killed or captured. So when President Santos, who was Álvaro Uribe's Minister of Defense, came to power, many people expected that he would continue the policies of President Uribe of attacking the FARC relentlessly. And actually, he continued that. He actually killed Commander Cano, who was the leader of the FARC in the first months of his presidency. But then he gave this U-turn about talking about a peace process. Now, the way that the FARC now want to present this peace process is actually, well, this is equals. We reach an accord, you know, because we're at the same position. Was there a military option? Was it possible to defeat the FARC militarily? Probably, we don't know, probably at a high cost. Adam Isaacson, one of our colleagues here in Washington, from the Washington office for Latin America, he says that we reach a point of bloody stalemate. You know, certainly the gains that the Colombian government could make against the FARC could have been made, but at a high cost. So it makes sense to negotiate a peace deal. The question is whether the concessions that the Colombian government gave to the FARC justify that reality.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. Back with more right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
The signing of this accord is our country's best opportunity to move towards social justice and progress on the basis that the doors of true democracy will be open, so that social and political opposition movements enjoy full guarantees.
That was FARC leader Rodrigo Londono. Welcome back. We're talking about the ceasefire in Colombia after more than half a century of conflict. Let's get back to our guests. Senator, you're very critical of this deal that's been worked out in Colombia. And I'm going to ask you the question that I posed to Eric, and that is, what is the alternative?
I think you shouldn't be content with giving a terror organization just political representation and all kind of like prizes for all the bad they have done to Colombia. Because we did a negotiation with the paramilitary armies. In that case, the paramilitaries were stronger than FARC are now. They had committed horrible, they were also with drug trafficking and illegal mining. And even though the government make a good negotiation in which what we negotiated was the length in which they will stay in jail, for crimes against humanity. Those who were the heads of the paramilitaries will have to pay jail. The other ones will get free and will have the opportunities and all the process of getting them back to the society. So what I think is, of course, you should negotiate, but the question here is that, in my opinion, and in many Colombians' opinion, the government exceeded for very much what the Colombians should be able to give to a terror organization to take them back. What they gave is everything. They almost gave them political representation for criminals who committed crimes against humanity. What kind of society will you build when you have the victims seeing those who killed their daughters, sisters, fathers as political figures? How would you feel if it was your daughter or your dad? So what I think is this impunity, this whole process of not giving justice to erase everything that had happened, will peace in Colombia. It will be a lot of more violence as it happened in the 90s. I was telling you, they promised us peace in the 90s with a new constitution and this whole negotiation. And what happened was 90s was horrible for everybody. So I think it should be a combination of the strength of the state, pushing the terror, are also a negotiation in terms that are good for the Colombian people.
All right, Senator, I take your points there, but as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the show, there appears at this stage to be widespread support among the Colombian people for this deal that's been negotiated by the government. There is going to be a referendum sometime in July, and the majority of Colombians will approve this deal.
Well, that isn't probably true. If you see the surveys, the last surveys, what you see is that 80 to 70% of the people are against FARC not paying jail. They're against that they have political representation. And the plebiscite that they're doing, it's a very tricky one. They reduce the threshold of participation from 50% to 13%. They gave money only to the government to promote the jazz. So it isn't a real way of asking people. If you ask Colombian if you want peace, of course, everybody wants peace. The question here is that if you think that impunity and having prices for being a killer, it's a good policy for building a peace process.
Okay, Eric, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm a historian. So I look at this historically as well, and it seems to me that there are two things we need to consider. First of all, you had earlier in the 1980s, the M19 guerrilla force actually was incorporated into the body politic. They left their arms. Many of their leaders were killed by paramilitaries, assassinated afterwards, but there are a number of people right now who are prominent politicians within Colombia who come from the M19. So this is a process that has worked before. And they certainly were criminals in that sense as well, though they would say these are political crimes. These are not crimes against humanity or something like that. Now, clearly the FARC has been much more violent than the M19 was. But one thing to consider is that the FARC also began as a movement precisely because there was no option for the left to have any kind of participation in Colombian politics because they continued to assassinate the leaders and they're simply unable to do so. So in a sense, this was a reaction against the closing of the system that was run only by the elites and nobody else could come in. And thus, in that sense, I think there is a historical debt, if you will, that if the FARC, in fact, represents at least part of, and of course the opposition says it only is a criminal narco-terrorist gang, which are, I think, terms that I would reject, not to say that there aren't elements of that, but they're essentially still in many ways a political movement. And if you don't accept a left-wing political movement into the body politic that had much legitimacy and obviously has been corrupted to a certain point, then it's very difficult for the Colombian politics to be whole again. Because I think that any government needs a left and a right and a center, and here if they in fact are incorporated into politics, represent in many ways a certain portion of the left, that they represent all of them, and that in a sense is something that Colombian politics and the political system needs.
Juan Carlos?
Yeah, how the question is asked is very important here, as the senator mentioned.
That's the referendum?
Yeah, because if you ask Colombians, certainly, if you ask Colombians, do you want peace? Many of Colombians want peace. But when you ask them, are you willing to give these concessions to the FARC? Are you willing to let them go without facing any punishment? Are you willing to let them have political participation? That's when people become more reticent, and they're like, well, no, actually no. So how this campaign is going to be conducted is important, and we already see that the government is going to be fully behind the accord, of course.
I presume the referendum will ask the straight question of, do you support this agreement or don't you support it?
Yeah, and the question is whether the Colombian people are going to be properly informed about what's in the agreement. We've seen where we just saw what happened in Britain with Brexit and how people can vote under false pretenses. So, but another important point is that even if people are willing to bite the bullet, even if Colombians are willing to bite the bullet and say, okay, if this is the price we need to pay in order to have peace, let them go without punishment, let them have political participation. Are we going to get peace in exchange? That's the big question. Is the FARC actually going to disarm? Is the FARC actually going to quit their profitable drug trafficking businesses? And is the FARC going to disarm and not intimidate people during the political process while being armed? And we already seen some episodes of the FARC promoting the peace agreement while being armed in several towns of Colombia. So those are the critical questions. Can you have peace in Colombia when you have an agreement that undermines the rule of law? Those are the questions that eventually need to be asked to the Colombian people, and I hope that the Colombian people will have all the elements at hand in order to make a wise decision.
Okay, Senator, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I would like to say that it isn't true that Colombia doesn't have a left participation. We have a lot of leftist parties. Actually, we have one very strong one, which is El Polo Democrático, and they have not killed people. So it is not a matter of if you have left or not. And when they say that El Frente Nacional, a period in Colombia in which the two big parties, liberales and conservadores, take turns to governate, it wasn't true that they cannot run. Actually, they did run, but they didn't win. It's different. So I think you shouldn't buy all these stories about FARC, because what triggered the FARC movement wasn't inequality, wasn't a lot of things. It was that a lot of guerrillas were being formed in all Latin America. They were being financed by Russia and Cuba, and they have these huge armies all over Latin to take over with communism. It isn't true that that the left didn't have participation. They did participate, but they didn't win. Actually, in many senses, you can say that the Liberal Party, which is in the International Socialist League, has been representing left. And we also have a lot of parties more left than that have been in all the elections. So I think there is a lot to see over that story that FARC is telling.
Okay.
FARC was this movement of guerrillas all over Latin America who take over, control the drug trafficking business, they have extortion business, they have kidnapping business, and they get really big and really rich.
Okay, Eric, do you want to respond to that? You know, the fact that the senator is saying that the left is represented in Colombian politics.
Absolutely, the left is represented, but not fully. And the FARC, I think, looking at it historically, clearly comes from that. In fact, the FARC started out as liberal guerrillas. And when they couldn't, from peasants, in fact. And this is interesting because M19 was more middle class. FARC actually was a peasant movement. And they then switched over to armed conflict. And clearly it had to do also with the example of Cuba. And the Cubans helping them, et cetera, et cetera. But at that point in time, it was quite clear, and we can go farther into Colombian history about La Violencia, which is a period of violent conflict between liberals and conservatives, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have time to do that. I'd love to do it. But in fact, I think the genesis of the FARC guerrillas was seen as an option of finally getting some kind of space within the Colombian system. Now, clearly, they're revolutionary as well. So it's complicated. It's not simple.
One final question, very quickly, Juan Carlos. Does President Juan Manuel Santos have the political support to push through this deal? Because as we heard from our reporter, his personal approval rating is very low.
His personal approval rating is very low. Some polls indicate that he's the most unpopular Colombian president in recent history. But he has the money from the government in order to push for this agreement and the aspirations of Colombians who want to live in a country with peace.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to call any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.